Victoria Sterling returned to her Manhattan penthouse 2 hours earlier than expected, ready to fire the latest janitor who couldn't handle her traumatized twins. Since her husband James had died in a plane crash 2 years ago, 8-year-old twins Mason and Emma had become uncontrollable. 11 cleaning staff fired in 18 months. But when she quietly opened the door to avoid disturbing anyone, what she saw paralyzed her completely. In the main living room, the new janitor, Carlos, was cutting a homemade chocolate cake, while the children laughed and clapped their hands seated at the elegant dining table. It was the first time she'd heard them laugh in 2 years. What Victoria didn't know was that Carlos harbored a devastating secret. He was the son of the patient she had condemned to death by denying him experimental medicine to protect her pharmaceutical company's profits. He had come there for one reason only: to make the woman who had killed his father pay the price for her greed. But seeing those children broken by grief, his perfect revenge plan was about to encounter an obstacle he had never anticipated: the innocent love of two souls who needed him more than he needed his vengeance. The Sterling penthouse overlooked Central Park like a monument to success and sorrow. 30 floors above Manhattan, the luxury apartment had become a mausoleum of memories after James died in that corporate jet crash 2 years ago. Victoria stared every morning from her office window at the park where James used to take the twins for weekend picnics, a memory that now pierced her heart like a rusty blade. The Sterling biotech empire continued growing relentlessly under her ruthless leadership. $5 billion in revenue, laboratories in 16 countries, patents worth more than some nations' GDP. But all this success came at a price Victoria had been paying long before James's death. The decisions she made in board meetings, denying experimental drugs to patients who couldn't afford them, delaying production of life-saving medicines to maximize profits, buying and burying research that would make their most profitable products obsolete, had made her one of the richest and most hated women in America. Mason and Emma, 8 years old, had become living ghosts of what was once a happy family. The boy had stopped speaking 3 months after his father's death, communicating only through looks filled with rage Victoria couldn't decipher. The girl had developed nighttime panic attacks that woke her screaming James's name, crises that none of the 11 cleaning staff had managed to handle for more than a few weeks. The first janitor, Mrs. Patterson, a 60-year-old woman with 30 years of experience, had quit after 3 weeks, declaring the children needed much more than a cleaning lady could offer. The second, a German girl specialized in childhood trauma, had lasted a month before fleeing in the middle of the night without leaving even a note of explanation. Each firing confirmed what Victoria refused to admit. Her children hadn't just lost their father. They had lost her, too. Work had become her drug, the only way to avoid thinking about the emptiness James had left and the growing feeling that her wealth was built on the suffering of families like hers had been before the tragedy. The 11th janitor had left that morning after a particularly dramatic episode. Mason had destroyed the chemistry set Victoria had bought him for his birthday, throwing test tubes and reagents against the walls while screaming incomprehensible words. Emma had hidden under the kitchen table for 6 hours, refusing to come out or eat. The woman had left a brutal diagnosis before leaving. These children were dying inside, while their mother escaped her parental duties. Carlos Mendoza's resume arrived that same afternoon. 26 years old, psychology degree, specialization in post-traumatic disorders, impeccable references from Manhattan's elite families. During the phone interview, he had shown an understanding of childhood trauma that struck Victoria, talking about innovative techniques to rebuild broken emotional bonds, how to transform pain into growth. What Victoria couldn't know was that, on the other end of the phone, Carlos was clutching the last photograph of his father, Roberto Mendoza, who had died 6 months earlier after a desperate battle against pancreatic cancer. The same Roberto who had begged Sterling Biotech to include him in an experimental trial for a revolutionary drug, only to be told he didn't have the adequate economic profile to participate in the program. Carlos had done his research. He knew his father had died not from lack of available treatment, but from lack of money. Victoria had personally signed the refusal to Roberto's request the same day she approved $5 million bonuses for research division executives. While his father was dying in a public hospital bed, Sterling was celebrating record quarterly profits with $1,000 champagne. The plan was simple. Enter Victoria Sterling's life, gain the trust of her traumatized children, and then destroy the family from within exactly as she had destroyed his. But looking at photos of the twins Victoria had shown him during the interview, Carlos began to feel something unexpected stirring inside him. Those children were victims as much as his father had been, trapped in a tragedy they hadn't chosen. While packing to move into the penthouse, Carlos couldn't imagine that the children he was about to meet would change not only his revenge plan, but his very understanding of justice, family, and unconditional love. Carlos arrived at the Sterling penthouse one September morning, with his heart armored by hatred and a bag that concealed compromising documents about Victoria. Medical correspondence about his father's death, evidence of corporate decisions that had condemned Roberto, and hundreds of other patients to death for economic reasons. The magnificence of the property struck him, despite his vengeful intentions. 18th-century palace restored with impeccable taste, magazine-worthy interiors, breathtaking views of Central Park. But what impressed him most was the oppressive silence that permeated every room. Not elegant quiet, but the emptiness of a place where joy had died. Victoria welcomed him with the formal courtesy of someone who had learned to keep the world at a distance. 45 years old, distinguished charm marked by fatigue, dressed in suits that cost annual salaries. Carlos saw beyond the appearance, tension lines around her eyes, curved shoulders, the way she avoided lingering too long on family portraits adorning the main corridor walls. Meeting Mason and Emma was an unexpected emotional shock. The twins were beautiful, him with dark eyes like his mother, her blonde like her father must have been, but with something extinguished in their gaze that broke Carlos's heart. They weren't spoiled children. They were small victims of trauma consuming them from within. Mason looked at him with suspicion before hiding behind Victoria's legs without speaking. Emma smiled shyly, but Carlos noticed her nervous way of playing with a worn doll, the only tangible memory of her father she always carried. When Victoria explained the house rules, the children listened with that mixture of love and resentment typical of children who love an absent parent. The first days were a precarious balance between professionalism and strategy. Carlos had planned to be efficient but detached, gathering information for his revenge plan. But Mason and Emma weren't the rich, spoiled children he had imagined. They were wounded souls desperately seeking someone who understood them without judgment. Mason communicated through violent drawings that filled entire notebooks, his mute rage more eloquent than any scream. Emma asked devastating questions with the cruel naturalness of innocence. The turning point came the fourth night, when Carlos was awakened by Emma's screams during a panic attack. He found her sitting on the bed, trembling, staring into emptiness as if seeing something terrifying only she could perceive. For the first time in months, Carlos found himself crying not from anger toward Victoria, but from pure sadness. This child felt responsible for her father's death, exactly as he felt responsible for his father's death for not doing enough. At that moment, he understood that Mason and Emma were victims as much as Roberto had been. How could he use innocent children as weapons in his war? How could he add pain to pain that was already killing them? The next day, while helping Mason with a puzzle, the boy spoke his first words. The question, posed with disarming vulnerability, brought down all the defenses Carlos had built around his vengeful heart. He realized he was beginning to love them, not strategically, but with the visceral immediacy of paternal love. Every night consoling Emma from her nightmares, Every small progress from Mason, every smile he managed to coax from them was a step toward healing, not only for the children, but for him, too. What Carlos didn't know was that Victoria, secretly observing him interact with her children, was experiencing something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. She saw her children behaving like normal kids, smiling, laughing. The person responsible for this daily miracle was a man who seemed to love them with a dedication that went beyond professional duty. The moment that would change 4 destinies arrived on an October day that began like all others. Carlos had risen before dawn to prepare a surprise, a layered chocolate cake decorated with fresh strawberries, Emma's favorite dessert according to family photos from happier times. Victoria was supposed to leave for Zurich to present quarterly results to international investors, but the flight was cancelled due to a strike that had paralyzed half of Europe. Instead of calling Carlos, she decided to surprise the children by returning home unannounced. When she quietly opened the front door, Victoria expected the cold atmosphere that had characterized the house for 2 years. Instead, the sound that greeted her stopped her on the threshold. Genuine laughter of childish joy she hadn't heard since James was alive. In the main living room, Carlos was cutting a magnificent cake while singing a lullaby that James used to sing to the children. Mason and Emma sat at the elegant table, faces illuminated by euphoria. Victoria believed lost forever. It wasn't just the scene. It was the atmosphere of warmth and family normalcy she hadn't breathed in an eternity. Victoria sat at the table and for the first time in 2 years shared a moment of pure happiness with her children. During that extraordinary afternoon, she observed Carlos loving them with an intensity that went beyond any compensation. But what struck her most was the shadow of melancholy that crossed his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The same expression she saw every morning in the mirror. In the following weeks, the Penthouse underwent an extraordinary transformation. Mason had resumed speaking and smiling, while Emma slept peaceful nights. The deepest change was happening in Victoria. She began coming home early, participating in evening routines, feeling like a mother again instead of a stranger. One evening, while helping Carlos, Victoria realized how little she knew about him. He was extremely reserved, avoided personal topics with studied skill. When she asked about his private life, she saw him stiffen. The response about separating professional and private wasn't convincing. Victoria recognized the same pain she carried in his eyes. The moment of truth came when Victoria had to leave for London for 4 days. While organizing documents in her study, Carlos found something that froze his blood: medical dossiers of patients who had requested access to experimental drugs, and among them all, his father's file. Victoria's note was devastating.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Patient lacking adequate insurance. Inclusion would involve economic loss, not justified by benefits. His father had died from a cold cost-benefit evaluation that established his life was worth less than profits. In other files, he found hundreds of identical stories, families destroyed to fuel the profit machine. When Victoria returned, she found Carlos staring at the fireplace with a look she had never seen. For the first time, she saw the truth in his eyes. Not just pain, but ancient rage consuming him from within. The moment of confession had arrived, something that would forever change how they looked at each other. Carlos stood from the sofa with slow movements, each gesture charged with determination he had cultivated for months. Roberto Mendoza was his father, the man Victoria had condemned to death with a signature 6 months earlier, evaluating that his life wasn't worth enough to justify a loss in corporate profits. His real name was Carlos Mendoza, and he had come to destroy her exactly as she had destroyed his family. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria closed her eyes, and suddenly Roberto Mendoza's face returned clearly to memory. a middle-aged man with eyes full of desperate hope, who had spoken of his son studying psychology, how proud he was of him. She had signed the refusal that morning when she authorized million-dollar bonuses for research executives. Carlos had planned everything for 6 months. He had studied her life, traumatized children, weaknesses. He had entered that house intending to make her lose what remained most dear, Mason and Emma's love, exactly as she had made him lose the person he loved most. But now he couldn't do it. He had come hating her more than he thought possible, wanting to see her suffer, destroy her family, as she had destroyed his. Then he had met Mason and Emma. They were innocent children who had already suffered beyond any limit. How could he use them as weapons in his war? How add more pain to pain that was already consuming them? Above all, he loved them. He loved them more than he had ever loved anyone after his father. Every night consoling them, every smile coaxed, every small progress had become more important than revenge. Roberto wouldn't have wanted his death to cause more pain. He was kind, generous, full of love. Victoria stood and went to the window overlooking the park, shoulders curved under the weight of revelation and guilt she had carried for years. His father hadn't been the first she had to refuse, wouldn't be the last. Every year, hundreds of people like him died because she decided saving their life would cost the company too much. She turned toward Carlos, face marked by suffering he didn't expect. She was a monster who had built an empire on the corpses of people like his father, and every night went to sleep telling herself it was the inevitable price of scientific progress. But when James died, when she saw her children destroyed by pain, for the first time she understood what it meant to lose someone you love more than life itself. It wasn't an excuse for what she had done to his father, family, hundreds of other families. But if he needed to know, she didn't spend a day without thinking about the faces of people she had condemned. She didn't spend a night without dreaming of children left orphaned because of her decisions. Carlos's question came as a whisper. Why his father? Why that signature? That day? Victoria answered with brutal honesty. Because that day she had authorized $50 million for a new drug that would make his father's medicine obsolete. Her head was full of financial projections, and his father was just an item on a list of costs to eliminate. But if Roberto were alive today? Victoria looked him in the eyes with the same desperation she had felt when doctors told her James would never wake up. Today, she would sign authorization immediately, sell half her shares to save him, because she had learned no profit in the world was worth a father's life to his son. They remained in silence. Two people destiny had set against each other, but who now found themselves united by pain that went beyond revenge and forgiveness. Victoria asked what happened now. Was he leaving, telling everything to the children, convincing them their mother was a monster? Carlos shook his head. He couldn't do it, not because she didn't deserve it, but because Mason and Emma didn't deserve to lose their mother too, after already losing everything else. But he couldn't continue pretending not to know who she really was, continue working for the woman who killed his father, as if nothing had happened. The proposal he made surprised Victoria. He wanted her to change. He wanted her to use her power to save, instead of kill. He wanted his father's death to serve at least to transform her into something better. It was an impossible, utopian request, against everything she had built in her career. But looking at this man who had loved her children when she couldn't, who had brought light to a house destined for eternal darkness, Victoria felt something move inside her she had never experienced before. It wasn't just remorse, it was the possibility of redemption she had never believed possible. If she succeeded in really changing, transforming the company into something that saves instead of kills, would he stay? Would he continue loving her children as he had loved them so far? It was the desperate question of a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. 6 months after that night of confessions and promises, the penthouse had undergone a transformation that went beyond architecture and furnishings. Victoria had kept every promise made to Carlos, completely revolutionizing Sterling Biotech's corporate philosophy. The first act was creating a $100 million fund to guarantee free access to experimental drugs for all patients in need, regardless of economic situation. The Roberto Mendoza Memorial Fund had become an international model of pharmaceutical social responsibility. Hundreds of patients condemned by profit logic now had access to the world's most advanced treatments. Victoria had transformed her company from predator to healer, and each saved life was a step toward redeeming a soul she thought lost forever. But the deepest change was in family dynamics. Victoria had learned to be present, not only physically, but emotionally, for Mason and Emma. She had drastically reduced travel, begun taking the children to school every morning, reading bedtime stories, participating in every recital and important moment she had previously delegated. Carlos was no longer officially the janitor. Victoria had offered him the position of directing the charitable foundation, but he had chosen to remain as family coordinator, a role that allowed him to continue with Mason and Emma while contributing to the company's ethical transformation. Above all, he had become what none of them had dared hope: family. The most significant moment came when Victoria proposed accompanying her and the children to visit Roberto's grave. It was a bright spring day, and Carlos had never seen Victoria so nervous about an initiative involving the children. Carlos reassured her. His father had been an elementary school teacher who loved children more than anything. Knowing that Mason and Emma were happy, loved, growing in a family that now used power to save instead of destroy, would have made him proud. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, while the children played among the flower beds, Victoria and Carlos remained silent before the white marble headstone. Victoria knelt, placing white lilies, Roberto's favorite flowers. The words she whispered were from a woman who had learned that no profit was worth a father's life to his son. That evening, while tucking the children into bed together as they did every night, Emma asked a question that surprised them. Carlos's diplomatic response about family feelings was welcomed with enthusiasm by children who wanted them to always stay together, to have a complete family again. In the preceding months, through confessions, forgiveness, redemption, and shared work to transform the company into a force for good, Victoria and Carlos had developed something that went beyond mutual respect. It was mature love, built on understanding pain and the shared will to build something beautiful from tragedy's ashes. 1 year later, when the twins turned 9, they organized a party that celebrated everything they had overcome together. Carlos had perfected that chocolate cake that marked the beginning of their collective healing, and Victoria had invited all the people who had become extended family. Employees of the transformed company, patients saved by the Roberto Mendoza Fund, friends who had seen them reborn. During the party, while watching the children run happily through the penthouse, Carlos thought of his father and felt deep peace. Roberto hadn't returned, but his spirit lived in the love filling that home, in the joy of children who had learned that something wonderful can be born from the greatest tragedies, in the company that daily saved lives instead of counting profits. 2 years later, in Central Park, with views of the Manhattan skyline, Victoria and Carlos married in a simple but moving ceremony. Mason carried the rings, Emma scattered petals along the improvised aisle, and on the altar were photos of Roberto and James, the 2 guardian angels who had made possible this miracle of love, born from forgiveness. Today, the penthouse resonates with children's laughter, family projects, conversations about the foundation that has saved thousands of lives worldwide. In the main living room, next to family portraits, hangs a painting of 4 people under a rainbow, painted by Mason for their first meeting anniversary. It's the symbol of a family reborn not from blood, but from the choice to transform hatred into love. revenge into redemption, tragedy into hope. Every evening, when they gather for dinner in the dining room that once witnessed only silence and pain, they know Roberto is there with them. Not in the remorse his death had caused, but in the joy that made their rebirth possible. Because the most beautiful families aren't born from perfection, but from the ability to forgive the unforgivable and build together a future that honors the dead through love for the living. The story of the janitor who came for revenge and stayed for love has become legend in Manhattan's elite circles, a tale of second chances, impossible redemption, and how love can always triumph against any darkness. In the penthouse overlooking Central Park, 4 hearts broken by destiny have learned to beat in unison, creating a symphony of hope that still resonates today. Like if you believe even the hardest hearts can change with love. Comment which moment moved you most in this redemption story shared to inspire those who believe in the power of forgiveness and second chances. Subscribe for more stories of families rising again against all odds. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is the one we never carry out. Sometimes love arrives disguised as hatred to teach us forgiveness. And sometimes the most beautiful families are born from the ashes of the greatest tragedies. Because true courage isn't being unafraid of pain, but choosing love despite everything.